In the spring of 1945, Europe was collapsing into chaos. The German Reich, once a juggernaut stretching across the continent, was now fractured, desperate, and on the verge of collapse. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines had broken down, and the once feared Wehrmacht was battered from every direction. Yet one final natural barrier stood in the path of the Allies, the Rhine River. Wide, swift, and heavily defended, it was Germany's last shield before the Allies could drive into the heartland and end the war. The Rhine had always carried with it a myth of invincibility. For centuries, it had served as both a lifeline and a fortress. German generals believed that the river would stall or even break the momentum of any invader. After all, bridges could be blown, ferries destroyed, and every crossing point turned into a death trap. And in March of 1945, that was precisely what the German High Command intended. They ordered their men to hold the river at all costs, convinced the Allies would falter at its edge. But what the defenders did not know was that the Americans were bringing with them a secret weapon, a machine so strange, so unexpected, that it blurred the line between land and water. They called it the DUKW. Soldiers simply nicknamed it the Duck. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't armored like a tank. But it could do something no other truck in history had done. It could swim. The story of the DUKW begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the factories and design rooms of the United States years earlier. During the war, American engineers had been tasked with creating vehicles that could handle the impossible logistics of global conflict. Troops had to storm beaches, cross rivers, and carry supplies through terrain that trucks and ships could never reach. The solution was this ungainly, six-wheeled amphibious truck, capable of driving like any other vehicle on land, but also sliding into the water and propelling itself forward like a boat. At first glance, the Duck was hardly intimidating. It looked awkward with its long hull-shaped body, open cargo space, and flat lines. Many soldiers who first saw it laughed. How could this odd contraption make a difference in war? But the true genius of the DUKW wasn't in its appearance. It was in its adaptability. It could carry 2.5 tons of supplies, troops, or ammunition. It could climb steep riverbanks, survive rough water, and deliver desperately needed cargo directly from ship to shore. In the Pacific Theater, the Duck had already proved its worth, ferrying men and material across island beaches where traditional vehicles bogged down. In Italy, it had supported the Anzio landings and supplied troops in areas where bridges were shattered. Quietly, without fanfare, it had become one of the unsung workhorses of the Allied war effort. But in early 1945, the Duck was about to step into the spotlight of history. As American forces advanced toward the Rhine, commanders knew the crossing would be one of the most dangerous operations of the war. German defenders were dug in on the far bank, artillery positioned to shred any attempt to ford the river. The Allies had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a stroke of luck that shocked the Germans. But elsewhere along the river, bridges were gone. The Germans had blown them apart. Without them, massive armies and their equipment couldn't cross quickly enough. The Rhine wasn't just another river. It was wide, sometimes more than 1,300 feet across. Its current was fierce, especially in springtime. Any makeshift rafts or boats could easily be swept downstream. For the Germans, this was their last great hope, to force the Allies into a costly and time-consuming delay at the river's edge. Yet the Americans had no intention of being stalled. Their generals, Omar Bradley, George Patton, and others, were determined to smash through the Rhine barrier and push into the German heartland with unstoppable force. They needed speed, surprise, and ingenuity. And here, the DUKW came into its own. Few German commanders even knew such a vehicle existed. Intelligence reports had mentioned amphibious trucks, but to most of the Wehrmacht, it sounded like a rumor. How could a truck drive into a river and then crawl out the other side without sinking? It seemed absurd, and that disbelief would cost them dearly. As Allied units prepared for crossing, the DUKWs were lined up, engines rumbling, painted in dull olive drab. Soldiers clambered aboard, some skeptical, others grinning nervously at the thought of floating across one of the most dangerous rivers in Europe. To them, it felt like a gamble, but to the planners, it was a carefully calculated stroke of logistical genius. These ducks would carry men, guns, and supplies across the Rhine faster than the Germans could react. Imagine the scene: dawn breaking over the river, fog rolling low across the water, and the silence broken by the roar of engines. One by one, these strange vehicles rolled down the muddy banks, their tires splashing into the current. And then, instead of sinking, they floated, their propellers churning the water, guiding them forward. To soldiers on the far side, watching through binoculars, it must have looked like a bizarre apparition. Trucks swimming across the river. This was not the kind of enemy the Germans had prepared for. They had expected pontoon bridges, maybe temporary ferries, but not a fleet of amphibious trucks driving straight across the Rhine under cover of smoke and artillery fire. The duck turned what could have been a grueling, bloody river crossing into a lightning-fast maneuver that stunned the defenders. But to truly understand how dramatic this moment was, you have to place yourself in the shoes of both sides. For the Americans, this was the culmination of years of engineering and planning, the payoff of a machine many had underestimated. For the Germans, it was a nightmare realized, proof that their last natural fortress was no fortress at all. The crossing of the Rhine marked the beginning of the end. But the story of how the DUKW helped make it possible is more than just a tale of machines. It's a story of surprise, ingenuity, and the way seemingly small innovations can tilt the course of history. And so, as the Allies prepared to strike the final blow against Nazi Germany, the humble duck, mocked by some, ignored by others, was about to swim its way into legend. The morning of the Rhine crossing was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. The river loomed ahead like a black ribbon, restless and alive, swollen with spring currents. The German defenders had spent days preparing ambush positions, digging into bunkers and sighting artillery. They believed the Americans would have to rely on slow pontoon bridges or risky assault boats. What they did not anticipate was a silent fleet of amphibious trucks waiting just beyond the fog. At first, the American infantry crouched low on the western bank, rifles clutched tightly, listening to the distant rumble of artillery. Then came the signal. Engines roared to life. The DUKWs rolled forward, their large tires crunching across the gravel and mud. Soldiers who had never trusted the ungainly vehicles exchanged nervous glances, gripping the sides as the trucks picked up speed. And then, splash, one after another, they slid down into the river, rocking violently as they hit the water. For a heartbeat, many men thought the ducks would sink, but instead, the strange machines bobbed up, floating steadily, their propellers kicking in, churning the Rhine into white froth. The convoy of trucks began moving forward, forming a line across the water. To the watching Germans, it must have looked like a surreal nightmare, vehicles that should have drowned instead gliding smoothly across the river. The ducks weren't just carrying infantry. They were loaded with machine guns, radios, engineers, even light artillery, some ferried jeeps. Others were stacked with ammunition and supplies, and all of it moved in one coordinated surge. The Germans opened fire, mortars screaming into the river, artillery booming from the far bank. Shells splashed into the current, geysers of water rising dangerously close to the ducks. But the vehicles kept moving, weaving and bobbing, some taking hits, but continuing onward. The Allies had prepared well. Smoke shells drifted across the water, laying down a gray curtain to obscure the crossing. Fighter bombers screamed overhead, strafing German gun positions, silencing nests of machine gunners. On the river itself, the ducks powered forward with stubborn determination, carrying the weight of the invasion across one of Europe's most formidable barriers. For the men inside the DUKWs, it was a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Some later recalled how strange it felt to be driving a truck on water. Others admitted they prayed with every wave that the ungainly craft wouldn't capsize. But as more and more ducks reached the far bank, climbing effortlessly onto German soil, confidence surged. The unthinkable was happening before their eyes. The Rhine was no longer a wall. It was a doorway. What made the duck so effective was not just its ability to float, but its versatility once ashore. The moment the vehicles clambered up the muddy eastern bank, they switched roles from boat to truck, grinding forward on their 6 wheels, delivering troops straight into combat. There was no pause, no vulnerable unloading phase, no waiting for bridges. Supplies that would have taken hours to transport using conventional means were suddenly arriving within minutes. This speed shocked the Germans. Their defensive plans had relied on delaying tactics: destroy bridges, cut off ferries, force the Allies to build pontoons under fire. Instead, the Ducks turned the crossing into a rolling assault. German commanders scrambled to react, shifting reserves. But every time they thought they could plug the gap, another wave of amphibious trucks poured across. It was like trying to dam a flood with bare hands. Interestingly, the DUKWs had originally been designed for logistics, not frontline combat. Engineers in America had envisioned them delivering cargo from ships to beaches where no ports existed. Yet here they were, charging into one of the most decisive river crossings in military history. Their utility was staggering. They carried wounded soldiers back across the Rhine to field hospitals. They brought engineers with bridging equipment. They ferried artillery pieces that could immediately set up and provide covering fire. No other vehicle could have done all of this so quickly and efficiently. One little-known fact about the Duck was its ingenious tire system. Using an air pressure regulator, drivers could inflate or deflate the tires while on the move. On soft sand or mud, they could release air to gain traction. On hard roads, they could reinflate for speed. This adaptability allowed the Ducks to climb steep riverbanks that would have trapped ordinary trucks. Soldiers later joked that the Ducks walked out of the river as if they were born for it. Another remarkable feature was their endurance. With a range of over 50 miles on water, they could handle long crossings. In the Pacific, some had even navigated through rough surf and high waves. On the Rhine, their stability and strong currents proved vital. Though some Ducks were lost enemy fire or accidents, the majority succeeded, delivering wave after wave of reinforcements. For the Germans on the eastern bank, morale began to crumble. Many Wehrmacht soldiers had been told the Rhine was uncrossable. Propaganda had promised that the Allies would be stopped cold at the river. But now, as American trucks literally swam toward them, disbelief gave way to panic. Some units broke and ran. Others fought desperately, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. The Ducks had stripped the Rhine of its defensive power. The crossing also revealed the psychological impact of innovation in warfare. The Germans had built their strategy on predictability: bridges, boats, pontoons. When confronted with something entirely unexpected, their carefully laid plans fell apart. It wasn't just a physical act of crossing that mattered. It was the shock value. Soldiers on the front lines admitted they had never seen anything like it. Some later said they thought the Americans were using strange secret weapons. In truth, the Ducks were no secret, just underappreciated until that very moment. Meanwhile, back in the Allied command posts, generals marveled at the speed of the operation. What could have been a drawn-out, bloody fight became a rapid, decisive breakthrough. Bradley and Patton both praised the Ducks, noting how they transformed a logistical nightmare into a tactical advantage. Patton, never one to mince words, reportedly declared that with Ducks, no river is too wide, no obstacle too great. As the Allies surged into Germany, the DUKWs kept working tirelessly. They didn't just help at the Rhine. They supported crossings of other rivers like the Elbe, ensuring momentum never faltered. Wherever there was water in the path of the advance, the Ducks were there, bridging the gap. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing about the DUKW was how ordinary it seemed after the fact. Unlike the Sherman tank or the Mustang fighter plane, it never became a symbol of American power. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heavily armed. Yet its impact was undeniable. It represented the quiet power of logistics, the idea that wars are won not only by firepower, but by the ability to move men and material where they're needed most, faster than the enemy can react. The Germans never fully recovered from the shock of the Rhine crossing. Their last offensive dream had been shattered, and the way into the heart of Germany was wide open. The Duck had helped make it possible. Still, the story was not yet over. The final weeks of the war would see even more dramatic uses of the DUKW, including one last monumental river crossing that cemented its place in history. But in March of 1945, on the banks of the Rhine, the Duck had already secured its legend. The success at the Rhine stunned the world. For months, German propaganda had promised that the river was a wall of steel and water, a line no invader could cross without suffering catastrophic losses. Yet in a matter of days, American forces had swept across it. The amphibious DUKWs had done what seemed impossible. They had erased the last great natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Nazi Germany. For the Germans, the psychological blow was immense. Soldiers on the front line spoke in disbelief of trucks that swam, vehicles that appeared from the river like phantoms. Commanders scrambled to issue orders, but by the time reinforcement arrived, the Americans were already entrenched on the eastern bank. German counterattacks sputtered, often cut down by artillery and tanks that the Ducks had already ferried across. The speed of the crossing meant the Germans never had time to mount a serious, coordinated defense. This was the climax of Allied ingenuity. Every river that had once seemed like an obstacle was now nothing more than a temporary delay. The DUKW made water irrelevant. Within weeks of the Rhine crossing, Allied armies were racing across Germany, capturing city after city, shattering resistance as they went. The path to victory lay open, and the end of the war in Europe was now inevitable. But let us pause here and imagine the scene to the eyes of those who lived it. On the far bank of the Rhine, American soldiers scrambled out of their ducks, rifles ready, hearts pounding. Smoke drifted across the water, shells still bursting behind them. They had just crossed the most formidable river in Western Europe under enemy fire. But instead of exhaustion, there was exhilaration. They were not trapped on a beachhead, waiting for bridges. They were mobile, supplied, reinforced. The Ducks had given them momentum the Germans could not match. For the wounded, the Ducks became lifelines. Casualties who would once have lain waiting for hours could now be evacuated quickly, the amphibious trucks carrying them back across the river to field hospitals. For artillery crews, the Ducks meant guns could be moved where they were needed most, supporting the infantry within hours. For engineers, it meant vital bridging equipment could be delivered directly to the front, strengthening the crossing and expanding it. The impact of this cannot be overstated. In modern warfare, rivers are among the greatest challenges. Armies throughout history have been stalled or destroyed at river crossings. Julius Caesar at the Rubicon, Napoleon in Russia, countless generals in countless wars. But in March 1945, the Allies proved that with the right innovation, even the Rhine could be conquered. The Duck was not glamorous. It didn't fire shells. It didn't soar through the sky. It didn't smash through enemy lines like a tank. But in its quiet way, it represented the turning point of modern warfare. The victory of logistics over obstacles, of ingenuity over brute force. It was a machine that allowed armies to flow like water itself, ignoring the barriers nature had placed in their path. One of the most extraordinary facts about the DUKW is what happened after the war. Though it had been designed as a temporary solution, armies around the world recognized its value. Britain, France, Australia, and even the Soviet Union used ducks after 1945. They became standard in disaster relief, ferrying people and supplies during floods. They were used during the Korean War to move troops across rivers under fire. In Vietnam, they carried cargo through swamps and deltas where no truck could travel. Even in civilian life, ducks found a second career. Cities like Boston and London converted them into tourist vehicles, carrying sightseers on both land and water. People who once depended on them to survive battlefields now watch them glide through harbors, a reminder of their unusual history. Few military vehicles ever made such a transition, from war machine to peacetime novelty. But in 1945, on the Rhine, none of that was yet known. For the soldiers of both sides, the Duck was a revelation. To the Germans, it was a harbinger of doom, proof that nothing could stop the Allied tide. To the Americans, it was a symbol of resourcefulness, the quiet genius that turned the tide of war not with flashy weapons, but with problem-solving. As the Allies poured deeper into Germany, stories of the crossing spread quickly. Civilians whispered about strange floating trucks that had carried the invaders across. German soldiers muttered bitterly about being outsmarted by technology they had never imagined. Allied generals, meanwhile, recognized a profound lesson. Wars are not only won by courage and firepower, but by planning, supply, and the ability to surprise your enemy in ways they cannot anticipate. The Rhine crossing also marked the beginning of the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Within weeks, Allied forces linked up with the Soviets advancing from the east. Cities like Frankfurt, Cologne, and Dusseldorf fell. By April, the Allies were on the Elbe, preparing for the final push. And on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Think about this. From Normandy to the Rhine, the war in Western Europe had been a relentless series of obstacles: hedgerows, fortifications, rivers, mountains. Each one seemed like it might stall the Allied advance. But time and again, innovation overcame them. And when the greatest river of them all threatened to halt progress, it was not tanks or bombers that made the decisive difference. It was a humble duck. Today, the DUKW is remembered mostly by historians and collectors. You can still see a few preserved in museums. Their faded olive paint a reminder of their service. They don't inspire all like a Tiger tank or a Mustang fighter. But for those who were there in 1945, who rode across the Rhine on the back of one, the Duck was unforgettable. Its story is a reminder that history often turns not on the weapons we glorify, but on the tools we underestimate. The Ducks were mocked, dismissed, even laughed at when first introduced. But at the critical moment, they proved indispensable. They remind us that innovation is often unassuming, and that sometimes the strangest machines can shape the fate of nations. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the Rhine faded into the background. But for the men who crossed it in those ungainly, floating trucks, the memory never faded. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Against the odds, against the defenses, against the river itself, they had crossed. And they had done it because of the Duck. So when we think of the final Allied drive into Germany, of the crumbling Reich and the liberation of Europe, we should remember the unsung hero that made it possible. Not just the tanks and planes, but the amphibious trucks that swam where no truck should swim, carrying men, supplies, and hope across the waters of war. The German defenders never knew. They never imagined. And by the time they realized, it was already too late. The Ducks had crossed the Rhine, and with them, the Allies had crossed the threshold of victory.